What if your thoughts, emotions, and identity are just the output of a simulation inside your own brain? That is the eerie idea behind the simulated self paradox, which suggests that your conscious experience may not be a direct reflection of the world, but instead a highly detailed internal model, a simulation your brain runs to predict and interpret reality. Neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly generating predictions about what you will see, hear, feel, and even think, updating these simulations based on incoming sensory data. So instead of passively receiving the world, you might be experiencing a version of it created inside your mind, including a model of yourself. But here's the paradox. If your brain builds a simulated version of you to predict how you'll act and feel, how do you know which you is conscious, the real you or the simulated one? Some theories of consciousness, like the predictive coding model, suggest that self-awareness may arise from the brain's recursive simulation of its own processes, a model of a model of a model, with no solid core. For example, when you make a decision, your brain might simulate multiple outcomes and then project a narrative after the choice is made. Analogy: it is like a video game character that believes it is free-willed, unaware it's part of a larger algorithm. The simulated self-paradox blurs the boundary between the observer and the observed, raising the possibility that your sense of I may be the most convincing simulation of all. Is the you experience merely the output of a nested predictive model running inside your own brain, endlessly simulating both world and self? Modern theories of mind, particularly predictive processing and the free energy principle, propose that perception, action, and consciousness arise from hierarchical generative models that anticipate sensory inputs and correct errors. But when the system must also model its own modeling apparatus, a deep paradox emerges. Can a predictive model fully represent itself without falling into infinite regress or self-undermining loops? So far, so good, until we examine how the brain's generative machinery handles self-representation. In predictive coding frameworks, each cortical layer issues predictions downward and processes prediction errors upward, refining its internal world model. The self is thought to be a high-level node in this hierarchy, integrating bodily states, intentions, and memories into a coherent narrative. Yet to simulate its own model, the system needs a meta-model of its predictive structure, a model of the model, which in turn would require another layer to represent that process, and so on ad infinitum. How, then, does the brain avoid an endless stack of self-models? At its core, the paradox hinges on self-modeling closure and representational transparency. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger argues that the brain constructs a transparent self-model. We experience the model's content as direct reality without awareness of the modeling itself. This transparency sidesteps infinite regress by hiding the meta-representational processes from consciousness. The self emerges not as a fully articulated self-model, but as the singular output of numerous implicit inferences, a stable illusion maintained by tightly constrained feedback loops. Yet even this elegant solution conceals finer-scale wrinkles. Neural implementations of predictive coding rely on synaptic plasticity and precisely timed oscillations. Noise, injury, or atypical development can disrupt the convergence of self-models, leading to depersonalization or hallucinations. Disorders like schizophrenia and certain psychedelics may decouple prediction and error signal integration, exposing the hidden scaffolding of the self and revealing the paradox in lived experience. The system's insistence on model transparency becomes a vulnerability when its nested loops lose synchronization. In essence, the simulated self-paradox reminds us that consciousness and selfhood may be emergent byproducts of a brain wired for prediction rather than fixed essences. The I you feel is both the highest-level hypothesis and the most fragile one, an ever-shifting self-referential construct that your mind simulates to make sense of its own processing. Like other profound paradoxes, from quantum retrocausality to the size-dependent property paradox, this phenomenon challenges us to reconcile the unity of subjective experience with the recursive complexity of the underlying mechanisms, pointing the way toward a deeper science of self. The simulated self paradox suggests that our conscious experience may be generated by an internal predictive model rather than a direct apprehension of the external world. In this view, the brain constructs a running simulation, continuously comparing incoming sensory data to its own predictions and updating itself when errors arise. Our sense of being and agency emerges from this ongoing process of hypothesis testing and error correction. This challenges the intuition that we perceive reality unmediated, implying instead that our mind lives inside its own best-guess simulation. In virtual reality, a consistent stream of sensory predictions and corrections makes users feel present in a computer-generated world, illustrating how the brain can be tricked into inhabiting a model. It is like believing you are walking through a forest, even though you're seated in a flight simulator that updates its visuals and sounds to match your expectations. Traditional views hold that perception is a passive process in which external stimuli are faithfully recorded and relayed into consciousness. The simulated self framework reverses this, proposing that perception is active inference. The brain generates hypotheses about the world and only processes information that violates those expectations. Thus, external reality plays a corrective role rather than a constructive one. Recognizing this flips our understanding of sensation from snapshot taking to continuous simulation. Optical illusions exploit the brain's predictive shortcuts, such as seeing motion where there is none, demonstrating that perception follows internal rules more than literal stimuli. It is like reading a text in a foreign language script that you learn to anticipate. You see whole words before you actually decipher every letter. At the neuronal level, cortical circuits constantly send predictions down the hierarchy and route only the mismatch signals, so-called prediction errors, back up for updating. This economizes processing power by focusing resources on unpredicted aspects of experience. Over time, the brain's generative model becomes more refined, reducing error signals and fostering a stable sense of self within a coherent world simulation. The paradox emerges when we realize that all sensory experience is a blend of top-down prediction and bottom-up correction. Functional imaging during auditory hallucinations shows that inner voice activity arises from strong top-down predictions that suppress normal error signaling, making imagined speech feel real. It is like running a spell checker that only highlights words you didn't expect in your draft. The fewer the highlights, the smoother the writing feels, even if errors persist. The brain's predictive machinery follows Bayesian principles, combining prior beliefs and new evidence to estimate the most likely causes of sensory inputs. Neural hierarchies from primary sensory areas to frontal association cortex implement successive levels of abstraction, with each level predicting the one below it. This cascade ensures that low-level sensations and high-level concepts co-evolve in the internal simulation. When the hierarchy aligns, selfhood and perceptual stability emerge. When it misaligns, we experience surprise, confusion, or sensory anomalies. In studies of mismatch negativity, unexpected tones in a predictable auditory sequence evoke strong neural responses at multiple hierarchical levels, reflecting Bayesian updating. It is like layers of a weather model predicting local storms. Each atmospheric layer forecasts the one below, and the system only alarms when a forecast error propagates upward. Beyond passive prediction, the simulated self engages in active inference by selecting actions to confirm or disconfirm its own hypotheses. This means we don't just receive sensory data, we probe the world to minimize uncertainty in our internal model. Agency and intention arise as byproducts of this process, since every movement is an experiment to refine prediction accuracy. The paradox lies in the realization that freedom of will may be a reflection of our model's drive to reduce surprise rather than a metaphysical gift. When catching a ball, our motor commands are generated to produce predicted sensory feedback, and we adjust our trajectory to correct any mismatch. It is like a scientist designing experiments not for discovery's sake alone, but to test and refine an existing theoretical framework. Predictive models operate under nonlinear dynamics where small prediction errors can cascade into large perceptual shifts, explaining phenomena like the hollow mask illusion or sudden insight. Our sense of temporal continuity itself is constructed, with the brain backdating events to fill gaps, creating the illusion of a seamless stream. Thus, time perception and narrative selfhood emerge as the brain stitches its predictions into a coherent sequence. The paradox deepens when we realize that even now is a post-diction woven by our own model. In the cutaneous rabbit illusion, taps delivered discreetly on the arm are perceived as a continuous hopping sensation, reflecting top-down temporal interpolation. It is like editing a movie so cleverly that viewers believe they witnessed a single continuous take, even though multiple cuts were stitched together. If our conscious self is a simulation driven by prediction, then qualia, intentionality, and agency are emergent properties of a computational process rather than irreducible phenomena. Free will may be reinterpreted as the model's capacity to generate counterfactual predictions and choose actions that minimize long-term error. This poses profound ethical and philosophical questions about responsibility and personhood. If our experience is a self-generated narrative, the simulated self paradox thus forces us to reconsider the foundations of consciousness and morality. Experiments showing that brain activity predicting a decision precedes conscious awareness by milliseconds suggest decisions are made within the model before we feel them. It is like a puppet show where the audience believes the puppet is alive, unaware of the puppeteer's hidden strings orchestrating every movement. Testing the simulated self hypothesis requires teasing apart internal predictions from external stimuli, no easy task given their tight integration. Neuroimaging and perturbation studies can measure error signals, but inferring the content of the generative model remains elusive. Designing experiments that decouple prediction from perception risks altering the model itself, creating a measurement paradox. Consequently, empirical validation of the simulated self straddles the boundary between neuroscience and philosophy. Brain-computer interface research can disrupt predictions by injecting controlled sensory delays, but subjects quickly adapt, reforming their simulations around the new contingencies. It is like trying to observe a dream by poking the sleeper. Any poke changes the dream, making it hard to study the dream's original narrative. Advances in closed-loop neurostimulation and computational psychiatry may allow us to map individual predictive models and their breakdowns in disorders like schizophrenia or autism. Integrating deep learning models that mimic hierarchical predictive coding could offer testbeds for simulation theories of mind. Deciphering the simulated self promises new therapies for mental illness and a deeper understanding of human nature as an emergent phenomenon of predictive computation. Ultimately, the simulated self paradox may reveal that our most intimate reality is an ongoing self-generated simulation. Research on hallucination therapies is exploring how adjusting predictive priors via transcranial stimulation can reduce false perceptions in psychosis. It is like debugging a virtual reality engine by tweaking its physics parameters until the simulated world behaves more like the one outside.